The short Seamew is one of those aircraft where the ugly looks are the least of the problem. It was slow, strange, and genuinely dangerous. An anti-submarine patrol plane that turned vicious at exactly the speeds it was supposed to fly. In June 1956, Short's own chief test pilot, Wally Runciman, was killed demonstrating one at Belfast. He knew the airplane better than anyone alive. If it could do that to him, what would it have done to the reservists it was actually designed for? After the Second World War, the Royal Navy was looking at the Atlantic again and thinking, right, if this all kicks off with the Soviets, this is where the pressure comes. The sea lanes between North America and Europe were going to be absolutely vital, maybe even more than they had been against Germany, and this time the submarine threat looked nastier. The real worry was that submarines were getting a lot better. The German diesel-electric U-boats had shown where things were going right at the end of the war. It was one of those designs that made everyone sit up because suddenly you were looking at a boat that was quicker underwater, quieter, and much harder to find. The Soviets got hold of that technology and started building on it, so the Royal Navy could already see the direction of travel. And that was the problem. Britain had won the Battle of the Atlantic, but it had been far too close for comfort. One of the big reasons they eventually got on top of it was that they managed to get aircraft out over the convoys, either from shore bases or from escort carriers. Once you can get eyes and weapons over the water, the submarine captain has a much worse day. So if the next war meant dealing with hundreds of Soviet subs out in the Atlantic, the Navy knew the answer was going to be the same in principle. Get air cover over the shipping. Just do it on a much bigger scale. The Ferry Gannet and the Shackleton were Britain's serious anti-submarine aircraft, capable but expensive and complex. You do not scatter aircraft like that across every convoy lane and coastal approach. What the Navy wanted was a cheap, simple second-string airplane it could build in numbers if things went hot. Something that could fly off the little escort carriers left over from the war, hang around over a patrol area, find a submarine, and hit it. Simple enough for reservists, cheap enough to mass produce. Really what the Navy was reaching for was something very close to the anti-submarine helicopter idea, just before helicopters were properly ready to take over that job. In 1951, the Royal Navy put out specification M123D, and Shorts at Belfast got the job. Shorts' new naval aircraft, they had already built the Sunderland and the Sturgeon, and they had the setup to turn out carrier-capable airplanes without starting from scratch. The requirement also suited them. The Navy did not want anything fancy here. It wanted something rugged, simple, and cheap enough to build in numbers if the Cold War turned hot. What Shorts came back with, though, looked strange even by 1950 standards. One description of it was a camel amongst horses, and honestly, that is hard to argue with. The Seamew looked awkward, but the interesting part is that most of the awkwardness was there for a reason. Take the engine. Shorts had first drawn it up around a Merlin, which would have been the obvious old-school answer, but the Navy was trying to move away from piston engines at sea. They did not want ships carrying big stocks of high-octane avgas if they could help it. So the Seamew ended up with an Armstrong Siddeley Mamba turboprop instead, which is a lot better because turboprop gave you less vibration through the airframe, and just as important, you did not have an ignition system messing with the radar set hanging under the belly. And once you understand that, the whole airplane starts to make a bit more sense. The layout was basically built around getting the crew, engine, and sensors all lined up where they needed to be. The pilot sat up above the Mamba. The observer sat behind him, high over the electronics and weapons bays, right where he could manage the gear he was supposed to be working. They shoved both crew positions as far forward as they could, which looked odd from the outside, but from a pilot's point of view, it had logic behind it. You want good downward visibility if you are trying to bring the thing onto a small carrier deck, and if you are out hunting surface contacts, you also want both sets of eyes looking forward and down, not buried halfway back in the fuselage. The result was that deep, skinny fuselage with the crew perched way up high, which is really what gave the Seamew its oddball look. Same story with the landing gear. It had fixed gear and a tail wheel, which even then looked like a throwback. But again, there was method to it. The main legs were long enough to leave room for the surface search radar dome under the fuselage, and going tailwheel meant there was no nose gear in the way of the radar's forward view. Keeping the gear fixed also meant a lot if this was supposed to be a simple wartime workhorse. They even designed it so the main gear could be jettisoned in a ditching, which might give the crew a better shot at surviving a water landing. Underneath, it had a pretty serious internal bay for such a small airplane. 14 feet long, 3 feet wide, and even longer if you left out the rotating radar gear. It could carry the things you would expect for the mission: a torpedo, depth charges, sonobuoys, and rockets under the wings. The wings folded as well, because this thing was meant to live on cramped escort carriers, not spacious fleet decks. Even the tail looked unusual for practical reasons. The tailplane sat high on the fin, so the rudder had to be split around it. The Seamew was not fast, topping out at around 236 miles an hour, but speed was not the point. What mattered was that it could sit over a patrol area for about 4 hours at low speeds, which was perfectly useful for convoy escort work. It also had the sort of low-speed numbers the Navy cared about. Stall speed was around 50 knots. It only needed about half power to stay flying, and takeoff run could be around 500 feet in good conditions for something expected to get off a small escort carrier deck with not much wind to help. Those were exactly the kind of numbers you wanted to see. The first prototype flew in August 1953, and after that, Shorts took it around to air shows and sales tours across Europe, trying to show that this odd-looking little anti-submarine machine had a real place in the post-war world. By 1955, the Seamew looked like it had a future. Orders went in for 60 airplanes, 30 for the RAF and 30 for the Royal Navy. The Navy's plan was to hand it over to the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as a replacement for their old Avengers. So on paper, this thing had a job, it had buyers, and it had a place to go. But the world was already moving away from the kind of war the Seamew had been built for. Once thermonuclear weapons entered the picture, defense thinking changed fast. Suddenly, the assumption was that the next big war would be short, violent, and decided at the nuclear level, not through some long Atlantic grind with convoy escorts and reserve squadrons flying anti-sub patrols for months on end. That was the direction Britain was heading, and the 1957 Defense White Paper more or less slammed the door on the old idea of mass conventional mobilization. So the Seamew got caught in that shift. The RAF dropped its order in 1956. Then the Royal Navy disbanded the Volunteer Reserve Squadrons the following year, which basically pulled the rug out from under the whole program. That left the Seamew with no real home. 24 had been built, and that was that. Most never really got a life at all. A lot of them were just scrapped, some still sitting at Belfast waiting for deliveries that were never going to happen. And honestly, that may have been the luckiest outcome the airplane could have hoped for, because by then it was becoming obvious this thing had a serious handling problem. The aileron and elevator response at low speed was poor. The controls were badly harmonized and overbalanced, which meant the pilot's inputs did not produce what he expected, when he expected it. Shorts tried to fix it during development with all sorts of aerodynamic bandages. They added fixed leading-edge slats, cut slots into the flaps, reworked the ailerons, added slats near the tailplane roots. They were clearly chasing a bad habit that would not go away. The trouble was that the Seamew started running out of manners right where it was supposed to live. Low speed was its working regime. This was supposed to be an airplane that could hang around over a convoy, fly slow, stay stable, keep the crew working the mission, and operate off little decks and rough strips without drama. Instead, low speed was where it could start to get nasty. Contemporary descriptions use the word vicious, and that is one of those words that tells you everything straight away. Pilots do not use it lightly, and that puts Runciman's death in its proper context. During a display at Sydenham in June 1956, he attempted a loop, stalled, and was killed. One crash on its own does not tell you everything about an airplane, but in this case, it fit the broader pattern a bit too well. If the man who knew the thing best could lose it during a demonstration, handing it to part-time reserve crews and expecting them to work it from small carriers in rough North Atlantic conditions, would have been asking for trouble. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.